Attention viewers, this is another original Win production. Please stand by for your host, John Fisher 2.0.
This is John Fisher 2.0, and joining me today on this episode of Original Win Productions is the blogger Contra-Sedevacantism. Now, he's joining me from a secret bunker somewhere down south in Texas. His voice is automatically changed. His identity is strictly kept secret. There isn't even an avatar he's using so you could find him. Contra-Sedevacantism, or Contra for short, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, my dear friend. And I want to offer a warm welcome to all my Sedevacantist friends that are going to be joining us or that will watch in the future. For today's discussion, my friend, Mr. John Fisher, we want to discuss regarding, first and foremost, whether a pope can be a heretic, and then second, what the church can do as a response to a public and manifest heretic. So I don't know if you guys are familiar, there's a trend within Catholicism, especially in the Novus Ordo, which tries to assert that Vatican I and St. Robert Bellarmine taught that a pope cannot be a heretic whatsoever, either publicly or privately. Some authors, such as Dr. Robert Fastigi and Ron Conti and even Dave Armstrong, argue that Vatican I dogmatized Bellarmine's view that a pope cannot be a heretic. So I want to first address these claims. So
could I ask for something of a clarification, if you don't mind?
Sure.
All right. So first, starting off, the idea that a pope could not, in principle, be a heretic, is that a position that maybe not Robert Bellarmine, is that a position Catholics have taken in the past? I heard that it was a view attributed to certain Catholics like Albert Pigius, for example.
Yeah, that opinion is actually an erroneous attribution to him. He never taught that a pope couldn't be a heretic publicly, but he denied that he could be a formal heretic. So modern distinction between formal and material heresy. So he says a pope can't be a formal heretic. He won't adhere to a heretical proposition, at least publicly, with pertinacity, but he could do so as a material heretic. He could teach heresy publicly, but he would never teach it with pertinacity. That's the distinction which both Catholics and Sedevacantists ignore. So that's the primary issue with that.
Interesting. Now let's define the difference between a material heretic and a formal heretic. Let's say I was to say there are really 4 persons in the Trinity and Mary is the 4th person. What criteria would I be saying that, where if I was to say Mary was the 4th person of the Trinity, would I be a material heretic? And in what situation would I be a formal heretic? So
there's plenty of authors that clarify what constitutes a formal and material heretic. So John D. Logo, Cardinal Bello, Billot. So Cardinal Bello goes on and explains that a material heretic is one. Usually, when they speak of material heretics, they're speaking about those outside of the confines of the Catholic Church. So these are Protestants. But he also says that in a certain sense, material heretics can be Catholics who unconsciously believe an erroneous or heretical proposition, but they don't do so with the intention of defying the magisterium. They just do it out of a mistaken conscience or belief. So that's the distinction between a formal heretic and a material heretic. A formal one is one who separates themselves from the magisterium. Okay, so a heretic would also be essentially a schismatic too, because he's creating a new magisterium. He's not following the rule of faith of the magisterium.
I see. So to clarify, maybe as a solid example, if I was to say Mary was the 4th person of the Trinity because I wasn't properly catechized, and growing up I kept hearing this Protestant straw man, and then I just said, okay, so that's what we believe in. I'm not really going to defend it or anything. I guess that's just the difference. And like I just go on believing in it, not because I'm trying to defy the magisterium, but because I, through a broken lens and bad research and taking the word of Protestants, I come to that position, as opposed to I just do some deep theological studies. I develop a super high Mariology. I develop it so much that I go beyond what the magisterium teaches, and I assert it out of my own authority. At the second, and I keep doing so. At the second point, I would be a formal heretic. Would that be a fair summarization and a good example of the two?
Yeah, even St. Robert Bellarmine uses an example. He actually uses two examples. First, he uses the example of the Arian crisis. So he says bishops use a term, or didn't accept a certain term, homoousios, or consubstantial with the Father. They rejected that term out of ignorance. Okay, so he uses that example, and then he also uses an example of lay Catholics who utter blasphemous prayers out of ignorance. But we wouldn't call these people properly blasphemers or heretics because they're doing it out of ignorance. This is the qualification Bellarmine makes with regard to a heretical pope. He says that a pope can be a heretic as a private teacher, but only out of ignorance. So he can be a heretic, a private heretic, but only out of ignorance. So we'll get into this later. So Bellarmine uses the phrase private heretic to apply to the Pope's official capacity also. It's not merely his private theological opinions. He also uses an example of Honorius, Pope Honorius, Pope John the 22nd, and he does it with Pope Nicholas I regarding baptism also. So he uses this phrase private teacher to apply to the Pope's official teaching capacity. So this is going to be an important distinction to make when we get further on into this discussion.
So from what I understand of your examples, and maybe this is a good time to detour a little into history, Pope Honorius would be famous for teaching that Christ had only one will rather than two, monothelitism, but that was done in a private letter to a patriarch. Then again, you have somebody like Pope, I believe it's Pope John, who taught, he taught something along the lines of, you don't see the beatific vision between death and resurrection, and that he was corrected in. And the last one you mentioned in terms of a theologian who erred on baptism, I believe it was a Pope.
No, it was Pope Nicholas.
Pope Nicholas.
So he wrote to the Bulgarians, so this is official teaching letter regarding one could baptize validly with simply the name of Jesus. So we have this, in modern church where they'll baptize someone with only the name of Jesus versus the Trinitarian formula. Mm-hmm. And so, but I want to get back to the case of Pope Honorius. So people actually mistakenly believe this was a private letter. So this actual letter, there's two letters, and he addresses, Patriarch Sergius, was it, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Sergius. So he writes to him in his official capacity as Patriarch of Constantinople, asking for a clarification on this doctrine. But the Pope Honorius actually sends the same letter to Constantinople, Alexandria, and I believe Jerusalem. So he sends this letter to three distinct sees. So it wouldn't constitute a private letter or in his private theological opinions. Although he doesn't define anything dogmatically, it's still a letter that's addressed to the, you could say, moral, like most of the church. You could say, yeah.
Right. I guess by private might be a misnomer, but I believe Vatican I, when it defines the Pope teaching infallibly, he has to be addressing the church as a whole rather than specific patriarchs or even like a specific group of people. Like I believe that's something that is stated in the Vatican I document Pastor Aeternus. That's just what I mean by it. Not necessarily that only like a few individuals got it and they kept it secret from everyone else.
Yeah, that's actually the important distinction we need to make, because when Sedevacantists and some you could say, Catholics such as Dr. Robert Fasigi and the like I mentioned before, when they read Bellamy saying private teacher, they completely ignore how he uses the term. So when he uses the term private teacher, they think he's saying merely as his theological opinions. Say, for example, in books they might write or something along those lines. But they forget that he's actually employing it in the Pope's official teaching capacity. And so Sedevacantists and some Catholics, as I mentioned, deny that he can teach heresy in his official capacity, regardless of whether it's ex cathedra or not.
Right.
So that's the important part.
I see. So it is possible for a pope to teach heresy, but just not in an official capacity.
No, he can teach it in a official capacity, but not ex cathedra, addressing the whole church. So that's the important distinction.
All right, fair enough. Now, just to move on a little further, we've addressed the difference between a material heretic and a formal heretic, one who does it out of ignorance, the other who does it manifestly in front of the whole church in a way which is pernicious and making himself his own magisterium. Now, when we get to the Pope himself, there's a bit of a fuzzy area because this is a person who is not beholden to canon law. He is not under it. Nobody judges the see. And that's actually one of the most central things to consider here. What would it be for a pope to be a formal and manifest heretic? What would that even look like?
Okay, so regarding the first see, or the apostolic see of Peter not being judged by anyone, so there's two codes of canon law. There's a 1917 code of canon law and the 1983 promulgated by Pope John the Second. Pope John Paul II.
JP2?
So the 1983 one is Canon 1404, whereas the 1917 one is Canon 1556. So both of them say the same thing. The Pope or the first see cannot be judged by anyone. Okay, but here Pope Innocent and previous other popes, I think Pope Hadrian taught that although the church cannot judge the Pope for any crime, they make the exception or qualification for sins against the faith. So Pope Innocent says, I can be judged by the church for that sin only which is committed against the faith. And then in Bellamy's treatise on the councils, he cites the example of Pope Innocent III and other popes as well. And he cites also C. Papa in the same paragraph regarding he that will judge all must be judged by nobody unless he is found to have deviated from the faith. So all these authors make the exception of the church judging the Pope for the case of sins against the faith. So that's the only case in which the church may judge the Pope.
Right. So let's make a distinction here between canon law, which is ecclesial, it's akin to a civil law, and divine law, which is something God stringently puts judges and no one is over that. No one is over God's divine law. When a pope a pope cannot be judged based on ecclesial law, but he can be judged on divine law. Do I have that correct?
That is correct, but I would make a qualification regarding, especially regarding notorious heresy. So there's three, you could say, degrees of publicity regarding heresy. So there's occult, there's public, and there's notorious heresy. Or usually people use notorious and manifest heresy interchangeably, but canonically they mean something different. It's pretty much the same, but it's not exactly the same. But all the authors, all the theologians, all the canonists argue that a pope can only be deposed by divine law for notorious heresy. So if he's a occult heretic, he can't be deposed. And even in the case of public heresy, and I'll go a distinction between public and notorious heresy in a little bit, even the penalty imposed for public heresy, he cannot be deposed. So, for example, occult heresy imposes a late sententia excommunication. A public heretic is excommunicated by the same excommunication, and a notorious heretic the same excommunication. But we know that for Bellarmine, occult heretics are not excommunicated by divine law. So here, an important distinction needs to be made between public and notorious heresy. So what distinguishes the two? Okay, so there's two conditions that distinguish public and notorious heresy.
Mhm.
First is the degree of publicity. That means how public the crime is. Okay, it must be known by the majority of the community, any given community. Usually, an example of a local parish, or how many people in a local parish or community know the person has committed a crime. And then there's a second condition, and it's the perception that this crime is imputable. That means this person committed that crime with malice or the intention to violate the law. So these two elements must be present. But according to every canonist I read, these two elements can only be determined by an ecclesial judge. So a layman cannot determine whether this person is in fact a notorious heretic. So for notorious heresy, a judge can proceed without trial, but with public heretics, he has to give them a trial. So clearly there's a distinction. So if a judge is required to give a public heretic a trial, that means he can't be deposed by divine law. But a notorious heretic, canon law stipulates a judge can proceed without a trial. But here, although he can proceed without a trial, he still has to determine whether the heresy is in fact notorious. Mm-hmm. So he has to determine both elements: how extensive the heresy is, how well it's known by the public, and also how culpable his crime is. So even here, although a judge may proceed without trial, he's still the one that's responsible for determining these two elements.
Oh, interesting. So let's go into that a little more. So a notorious heretic, that would be somebody who goes beyond what's a public showing of a heresy. So, for example, if somebody was to say on one occasion, there's an eighth sacrament, maybe out of a mistake, that's one thing. But if he was to constantly teach this, then at that point it would be notorious and manifest. Like, how often would it have to be done in order for us to say, yeah, no trial needed? Let's just, we don't know this guy any obedience.
So, as I mentioned, these two elements, so degree of publicity, how public the crime is, mm-hmm. and also the degree the judge has regarding the person's culpability. So public heretic, you're not entirely certain, you're not absolutely certain or morally certain that this person is really culpable. Mm. Versus in the case of a notorious heretic, you are absolutely certain or morally certain that this person is culpable for his crime. So, as I mentioned before, only a judge can determine this particular element. A layman can't say, "Oh, this guy's clearly culpable for his crime." You're not really in a position of authority to determine that. You can assume it, but it has really no canonical effect regarding the person's status. Yeah.
So, and here's another question: can one be a Catholic in good standing and have this suspicion? So, for example, let's say, okay, this Pope Francis guy, I'm not going to hold the church or anyone else to it, but in my private opinion as a Catholic, I think he's not even the Pope. I think he's just Jorge Bergoglio. He's just out there pretending, and everyone's falling for it, and really we should get rid of him. But as it stands, I'm just holding this as my own private opinion. Is that a tenable position for a Catholic layman to say he goes beyond public heresy, he's in a manifest position, or even that requires a canonical judge to even delineate the two?
Well, Bellarmine explicitly makes this distinction regarding private judgment and public judgment. Mm-hmm. So anyone can make a private judgment, but it has really no effect. So you can assume the Pope's a heretic. It doesn't mean he's actually a heretic. So you can assume all you like he's deposed. It doesn't have any effect whatsoever. And Bellarmine explicitly teaches this, especially when it comes to his treatise on the council. So there's two distinct passages where he states that no one is allowed to assume the Pope has been deposed from his office unless he has been legitimately judged by a council of bishops. And this, so he goes into two distinct councils. So a regular Roman council or a imperfect general council. Mm-hmm. So either one would suffice in the case of a heretical Pope, but it is the judgment of the church that determines whether he is an actual notorious heretic. So, for example, in canon law, there's two sentences. There's a declaratory sentence and a condemnatory sentence. So declaratory sentence merely proclaims that this person is a heretic. It doesn't impose a penalty. So the declaratory sentence is not a penalty in itself, whereas the condemnatory sentence is a penalty. It strips him of various benefits, his fruits of his office, and so forth. So in Bellamy's mind, the church must issue a declaratory sentence for him to be considered a notorious heretic. So this is the important distinction.
Interesting. Now, let's go through some sedevacantist flaws that they make in all of this, and one question I'd have to ask is, where do when assessing St. Robert Bellarmine's position, where do they often go wrong? Like, what's the most common error you see when you read any Sede blog, writer, speaker, etc.?
So they read his comments on face value without taking into consideration his whole corpus, his whole writings. So, for example, he says in the first volume regarding manifest heretics are excluded from the church. Okay, yes, manifest heretics are excluded from the church, but who determines whether this person or cleric is a manifest heretic or not? And this is the important distinction comes into play between private and public judgment. So Bellamy says, I'll just quote him, "It is a private, that is an opinion which everyone chooses as true, but obliges nobody else." And he continues, "In the same way as the disputations of theologians and philosophers, the students are the judges. After hearing each side, they choose what they wish, but nobody can compel anyone to think likewise. Whereas a public judgment in a cause of faith is never attributed to the people." Right? So here he denies that the people or laymen can make a public judgment regarding a cleric. It's the appropriate or legitimate authority, the bishops, council of bishops, who issue that judgment. So,
all right, now I want to go over 3 streams of sedevacantist arguments. So the one you're addressing is a stream of argumentation that goes, he's a manifest heretic, ergo he is not the Pope. So that's one line of argumentation they use, and that's the most common one, which I'm glad we're addressing here. The second stream of argumentation they usually get into is, okay, he wasn't even legitimately elected to begin with. They'll usually find some loophole in canon law that a pope doesn't allegedly fulfill. Most recently, some people who are not sedevacantists, they're more benevacantists because they still think Pope Benedict XVI is still the legitimate pontiff, and Pope Francis really wasn't legitimately elected. And the third stream is they weren't even properly ordained bishops, and then they just go back to some of the reasons why the post-conciliar changes in the ordination rites are invalid. Would you mind, would you be willing to go into those 2 later streams, or do you want to just mostly focus on the first stream?
I can address all 3.
Okay.
So regarding so Bellamy, I want to go back to Bellamy for a sec.
All right.
So regarding private and public judgment. So I want to mention these 2 explicit quotes so we don't forget them from his treatise on the councils. So he says, "For then a general council ought to be gathered, either to depose the Pope if he should be found to be a heretic, or certainly to admonish him." So he recognizes that a council is the only legitimate authority to determine whether a Pope is a heretic or not. Mm-hmm. And then he continues, "Inferiors ought not to be free from their obedience to superiors unless first he were legitimately deposed or declared not to be a superior." So here, Bellamy says that a pope, as long as he is viewed as a pope by the clergy, by the clerics, by the bishops, he is such until the time he has been judged by a legitimate council. So regarding the arguments regarding the popes not being validly elected through some canonical issues or whatnot, mm-hmm. and then benevacantism, Benedict still being the Pope. So first and foremost, there's a notion called the universal acceptance of not the people, but the clergy. So universal and acceptance is known by, or is viewed by the majority of theologians as a dogmatic fact. So once a pope is determined by the majority of clergy hierarchy as the legitimate pontiff, that person is a pontiff. So to address some of the arguments regarding some of the canonical issues of Benedict's resignation. So Sedevacantists claim that Benedict resigned out of fear or pressure or whatnot. So Benedict himself has explicitly denied on multiple occasions that he resigned out of fear, even in his most recent interview where he denies any conspiracy theories related to his resignation. So regarding canon law, so the only cause for which the Pope would be illegitimately elected is for the cause of notorious heresy. Okay, and as I mentioned before, a notorious heretic is one that has been declared as such by the Church, and so he doesn't qualify, canonically speaking, as a notorious heretic. None of the post-conciliar popes, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict, Pope Francis, none of them qualify as notorious heretics, such that their election would be considered invalid. And so, but here, so there's another argument, and I've addressed this in my book. So although Sedevacantists can't demonstrate that the post-conciliar popes were notorious heretics before their election, for example, John the 23rd, although he was suspect of heresy, he was never viewed as a public heretic by the clergy or whatnot. And so they can't demonstrate with objective facts that he was actually a heretic such that his election would be valid. Nor can they demonstrate it with Paul VI, nor can they demonstrate it with John Paul II. And so none of these popes are such that their election would be invalid. They're not notorious heretics such that canon law would define. And so they transition into the claim, well, they teach heresy, and since the magisterium can't teach heresy, therefore something must have hindered their election. They don't actually demonstrate what hindered their election. They just say, well, something hindered their election. Mm-hmm. And I just go back and appeal to the universal acceptance of the legitimacy of the pontiff. I just go back to that same argument. If the clergy determines this person is a pontiff, he is a pontiff. Otherwise, you're just violating a dogmatic fact. So that's just a brief assessment of their arguments.
Interesting. Now, the one I dealt with first, if anyone's been following me for a while, has usually been the so-called invalidity of orders of the post-conciliar church. Now, have you addressed this specifically in any of your work? And if so, would you like to talk about it now? If not, would you like to just continue on the first and second stream of Sedevacantism?
Now, I'll happily address this. So right. This actual argument itself would have no application towards John the 23rd, would have no application towards Paul VI, John Paul II, or even Benedict, or even, depending on, I'm not sure when...
Some would say that he is... some would say the episcopal consecrations are invalid. Father Cicada, he is known for writing a corpus of, well, not a corpus. He's known for writing a few works delving into this and trying to show that they don't signify the power of the order, nor do they signify the office in the form. And if you look at someone like Father William Jenkins, they try to cast doubt on the priestly ordination. So you are right, Benedict, it would not fall if it comes to the priestly ordination, but they would question his episcopal consecration.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with when Benedict was appointed as bishop, so that's why I mentioned him. I thought he had been consecrated before the changes to the liturgy, but you actually read your article and linked it in the book in the relevant section. So I'll just mention the most powerful argument you make in your article. So you mentioned the fact that, so there's two elements. There's the governing spirit, and then there's the element regarding the role of the apostles establishing sanctuaries or something along these lines. So what is the sanctuary? Where the altar is. So what was the mission of the apostles to establish churches or sanctuaries, this altar where the Eucharist is held? So clearly the power of orders pertains to the bishop's power to establish these altars where they are the center of the Eucharistic assembly. So this is a unique, not only does it signify regarding grace, the governing spirit, but also the power of orders regarding establishing altars where they offer the Eucharist in the midst of the people. So that's the most cogent argument we offer.
Yeah, and it's based on the fact that because the bishops, especially as described in Lumen Gentium, because the bishops, by virtue of their episcopal consecration, are joined into the apostolic college, ergo they together bind the church in all times and places, insofar as they have that unity. If you read someone like Father Cicada, he usually tries to explain how this is not possible because it falls under apostolic extraordinary jurisdiction. In truth, though, when it comes to Lumen Gentium, they're not seeing it as a point of individual bishops having this power, just like the individual apostles did, but rather how that general power is given to the order of bishops later on. In the order of bishops, the Pope has that specific power to set up dioceses and jurisdictions. However, because they exist as a collegial body with Peter and his successor, what ends up happening is they in a sense share that power, and they spread the church together in all times and places. And the reason why, a bishop who does not have those abilities because he's consecrated in an illicit way, the reason that would follow is because although they have the functions in a latent sense, they have to actually be in union with the Bishop of Rome to exercise those functions. The letter Lumen Gentium actually tries to use a new word. It skips my mind in Latin, but it's essentially translates as something as functions or operations. That way, it's not reducible to jurisdiction because it's ontologically connected to the collegial body, but at the same time, it's not a power ready to act like the power of ordination. It's a middle term because it's latent, but it needs to be exercised in tandem with the Bishop of Rome. And that's how, and because it coincides with the power given to the apostles, because they're, in logic, the term is a conjunctive, because they're always together and they're never apart. It signifies that this isn't something like confirmation or another lower power the apostles had. It is specifically their episcopal consecratory grace. That's what's signified. So that's how I would break it down. That's the argument I gave, but there are others. So, for example, some who are in this society try to emphasize that because the laying on of hands covers a whole lot more than just the words specified by Paul VI, that it, like the wider prayer, has so much more that could technically be considered the form itself, that it doesn't even necessarily rely on those key words.
So what actually, what I another argument regarding the rights of the church being protected by the general infallibility of the church. Mm-hmm. So Sedevacantists try to avert this argument by claiming, well, Paul VI wasn't a valid pope in the first place, therefore is not a true act of the magisterium or the church. But here we can apply this to the general infallibility versus papal infallibility. Mm-hmm. So the sacraments, their validity, are protected by the general infallibility of the church. So the church, not merely the pope, promulgating a sacrament, you could say, a pseudo-sacrament, would violate the indefectibility of the church. And obviously, Sedevacantists would try to avert this by saying, well, he wasn't a valid pope, therefore it's not an act of the church. But I think even as a collegial body, I think it would apply to that as well, as not merely simply the pope,
Right. Not only that, but it would be an obvious case of begging the question. You're saying that Pope Benedict isn't a valid pope because of an invalid consecration, and you're saying the consecration has to be invalid because it was instituted by someone who wasn't a real pope. It's not really convincing to someone who doesn't already buy into the assumptions, so it can't really stand up as an independent argument.
And also has an additional problem that all the bishops currently living, none of them so far have, at least the ones ordained prior to the institution of the new Episcopal rite, are currently serving in any official capacity. So none of the bishops would have ordinary jurisdiction, or at least none that you know of, that they would know of, that have ordinary jurisdiction. And therefore, as I argue in my book, the church must have ordinary jurisdiction perpetuated for all times. And we must be able to determine which these legitimate bishops are according to the doctrine of formal visibility of the church. So some Sedevacantists will argue that, okay, there are certain bishops who have ordinary jurisdiction. They'll claim this. They'll either say they'll appeal to supply jurisdiction, claiming it's an ordinary power in some instances, which is not. Or they'll say, well, there's some bishops we don't know of who have ordinary jurisdiction. Okay, so regarding the second claim, so the formal visibility of the church argues against this. So we must know with moral certainty which bishops have legitimate succession. And going to the previous argument regarding, I actually forget what the previous argument was, but
I believe the previous argument is it's just considered a form of supply jurisdiction anyway. Yes. So supply jurisdiction is a delegated jurisdiction. It's not ordinary. And I go through this in my section on supply jurisdiction regarding, I cite several canonists saying supply jurisdiction is delegated, and delegated jurisdiction is opposed to ordinary jurisdiction. But the argument here is that ordinary jurisdiction must be perpetuated for all times until the coming of Christ. Interesting. Now, one thing to say specifically here is that some Sedevacantists will try to weasel their way out of it by saying, well, that is true of the Western rites. Some will say that they're doubtful to downright invalid in terms of their even their apostolic nature, and because they deny the fact that there is any material apostolic succession. That's just when a bishop lays hands on you and gives you the powers of a bishop, but you have no jurisdiction. That's the material apostolicity. Formal apostolicity requires jurisdiction to be handed down as well. They'll say, yes, the Western Rite no longer has that, but they'll say the Eastern Rite still has that because they have valid ordination. And even if they recognize the current pope as their head, we can't say that all of them are manifest heretics. Ergo, maybe among them there's a hidden one who can't, or a hidden line that's always just remained generally ignorant about it.
So I would actually address this in my book. So all the Eastern Catholic bishops, as far as I'm aware of, adhere to the Second Vatican Council. They are in communion with the Pope of Rome. So by adhering to the Second Vatican Council, according to canon law, you are therefore suspect of heresy. Okay, so the suspicion of heresy. So according to Sedevacantist narrative or thesis, every bishop would, by implication, be suspect of heresy simply by the mere fact that they adhere to the council. This would be a necessary consequence of their belief. Now, so if all the bishops of the world are suspect of heresy, at least the ones who have ordinary jurisdiction, that would violate the formal visibility of the church. Okay, so which bishops are actually teaching true doctrine, or which church has apostolicity of doctrine? So if they're adhering to this council, which is according to them manifestly heretical, how can the whole body of bishops be suspect of heresy? This denies the formal visibility of the church. You can't determine whether these bishops are actually true bishops, and it also violates the notion that there must always be true bishops in the Catholic Church teaching in a Catholic way. And Bellarmine actually explicitly states this, that there must always be Catholic bishops teaching in a Catholic way. So, but their adherence to the Second Vatican Council places a doubt on this. And so this is how I would address that argument. Even having a moral claim to doubt violates the visibility of the church, because
I have to be able to point to it, like say, yeah, this is where the church is, in order to practice my faith. Because Christ promised, "With you will be with me always." Well, I'm probably just giving a scriptural justification. I'm pretty sure you could cite some good authorities on this one. Bellarmine is very heavy on the visibility of the church, and because of the fact that there is room to doubt, it follows that I don't have moral certitude in practice, and therefore the whole promise just goes up in flames.
Yeah, that's actually what formal visibility means. You have moral certainty that these bishops have ordinary jurisdiction. That's a claim. So
could I perhaps just give a good illustration of this? As Catholics, if we are in doubt of somebody, let's say, consecrating the sacraments, even just doubt, not necessarily I know their orders are invalid, it's just doubtful they have valid orders, I'm not even allowed to approach the sacraments. So let's just say that certain doubts about one particular priest arise. Bishops are just not sure because of this doubt whether or not they're practicing. We as Catholics would have to stay away from the consecration of the Eucharist. Now, if that's what follows, just from a reasonable doubt of their their ability to consecrate the sacraments, how much more should that apply to the church itself? Because we should also have moral certitude in approaching the church. Would that be a good way of summarizing it?
Well, this doubt must actually be legitimate. For example, someone doubting whether a particular priest has faculties or not. Obviously, you would have to stay away if you actually in doubt. But this doubt has to be established, which, according to Sedevacantism, it's well established. The council is manifestly heretical. So, not opposing it is necessarily, by implication, you're accepting it. So, I don't see, you have to be suspect of heresy at the minimum, if not being a heretic, by adhering to the council or not objecting to it. So you are definitely suspect of heresy, and suspicion of heresy is in violation of the formal visibility of the church as insofar as the whole church is considered. Now, Sedevacantists have responded to this particular argument. So how can a pope or previous pope be suspect of a heresy? Okay, how can he be the pope, true pope, being suspect of heresy, but not the whole entire body of bishops? And the reason why is because a pope can be a heretic while the whole body of bishops cannot be heretics. So this is the plain distinction. Catholic doctrine holds that there must always be legitimate bishops throughout the whole centuries, throughout all the centuries. So that's the distinction. Pope can be a heretic, the whole body of bishops cannot be heretics. That's simple.
Interesting. And very forceful. Now, would you mind answering a few audience questions? I know our good friend Colin Gordon has a few right there, if you'd be interested. Or is there something more you'd like to elaborate on?
No, I'm happy to answer any questions. We can divert then into further discussions.
Fair enough. Let's go into Colin's first question. Hi, Contra. Some will respond to UPA by asserting that it requires the universal consent of the clergy and that even one bishop dissenting would destroy UPA. Your thoughts? And by the way, could you give the definition? Could you give what UPA is to our audience?
So, universal and peaceful acceptance. I already mentioned this previously. Is merely the moral unanimity of the bishops. So, there's many theologians that cite this, and they cite the example, besides the legitimacy of the Roman pontiff, they also cite the example of the ecumenicity of certain ecumenical councils. So, for example, Vatican I. The Vatican I was not accepted by all the bishops. There's the old Catholics. There's actually many bishops who rejected it. So clearly, when the authors speak regarding the universal and peaceful acceptance of the legitimacy of the pontiff, it's not an absolute unanimity. It's a moral one, because, as I mentioned before, they use the example of ecumenical council, Vatican I being the first. We can even go through a list of ecumenical councils that were rejected by many bishops. We can go through Chalcedon. We can go to, I think, even Ephesus. So we can go through a list of ecumenical councils that were rejected by many bishops. So clearly, the authors cannot mean absolute certainty or unanimity.
Interesting, and a very good point. Now, I'm also kind of curious as to how they would understand bishops who once accepted it and then rejected it. Like if we're going to be that stringent, could one bishop in retrospect say, you know, that wasn't a great council, I'm just going to ignore it? Like, and my friend Barely Protestant is in the chat, so he might get a kick out of this example. There at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in England, there were legitimately consecrated bishops who were like, yeah, maybe this Florence thing wasn't so great. Now, granted, maybe they had King Henry VIII threatening them, or the current regime under Cranmer and Edward the Sixth, was it? In any case, they could probably just say, yeah, we don't really accept that as authoritative. Or even with Trent's, that wasn't accepted in all places. So, although they didn't have jurisdiction at the time, so maybe that's a little different.
So actually using this example, I actually cite this example regarding Protestants not accepting the Council of Trent. So Bellarmine actually uses this example. He says, and I use this for the legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council. So Bellarmine writes that the Lutherans and Protestants rejected the Council of Trent, but the only way you can determine whether this council is illegitimate is by another council. And without that council, this council is valid because it's accepted by the majority of bishops. So Bellarmine makes this argument, and I use this in my book regarding the legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council.
Wow. By the way, the book is in the description bar below, so is Contra's amazing blog. By the way, I know this is off topic. You also have some recent articles arguing against the SSPX, so I'm pretty sure I have those to look forward to, and so does the rest of our audience. Now, sorry.
Yeah, hopefully we can do another discussion on the arguments posed by the SSPX regarding the liturgy.
Very good. I'd love that. Colin says, Original Wind Productions, I think it's important to examine how the fathers of the church identified schism. You can use that to determine how the church thinks of visibility. Interesting point. And one interesting point, just to build off of what Colin says, is while the early church did recognize that a schism is a split from the church, later canon law also elaborates this much better by putting the Pope as the focal point of this. If you are not in communion with the Pope or anyone in communion with the Pope, therefore you are ipso facto in schism. I think one interesting thing about that is it gives a much clearer and precise definition of when you are and are not in schism, as opposed to saying that it is a matter of whether or not you're in communion with the church. And to be fair, earlier on, like some Orthodox like to cite forms of communion where A is in communion with B and B is in communion with C, but C and A are not in communion with each other. That happens because without the Bishop of Rome acting as the fountain of unity, it's possible for you to have like these disconnected joints of communion. And that's something me and my friend Craig Trulia discussed in a previous blog post. Now, I want to ask you something. When it comes to a notion of schism, especially as it pertains to the early church fathers, do you think that when it comes to certain Sedevacantist groups and the fact that they seem to be very, how should I put this, at odds with one another, that it's just like very evidential how without the Bishop of Rome, you tend to have these little spats and squabbles between yourself?
Well, from the Sedevacantist mindset, these squibbles or schisms, you could say, really, even if I cite their differences, it's not going to really make any difference in their mind. They think they have the truth. So really, I don't think this particular line of or this approach would actually work with them. So I don't know.
Fair enough. By the way, folks keep coming up with your questions, and I'll just lead on the discussion. So we know that there's a distinction between an occult heretic, a public heretic, and a manifest heretic. And we need a council to tell the difference between when someone is a public heretic and when someone is a manifest heretic. Now, when it comes to church teaching, though, not everything that the Pope teaches is technically something that is infallible and definitive. Some things we just have to accept by dint of the fact that he is teaching it, and we have to lean upon their power. So it's not right that, so it might be the case that a Pope teaches something in a non-infallible way, and that because he's teaching it in this way, we as Catholics have to presume its orthodoxy and adhere to it. Now, what happens when that's not the case? When the Pope, although he's not teaching something which is infallible but still authoritative, and we seem to have issues where we want to say, yeah, but it seems like it's heretical or it's erroneous, and we shouldn't hold on to it regardless. Like some people will make this claim with Amoris Laetitia. What do we do in those situations?
Okay, so there's a general notions, even non-definitive. So usually when a person mentions definitive teachings is regarding infallible ones. So we can distinguish it between doctrine and dogma, but something that's definitive is something that must be held absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, but non-definitive teachings, okay, one must also give it assent to, okay, but it's not an absolute assent. You get these teachings can be overturned; they're not irrevocable. And this Pius XII even states this. So it's not irrevocable decisions, teachings. They can be overturned, but still, if there's a serious reason to doubt that these are legitimate teachings, if they're heretical or whatnot, erroneous, one can appeal to what's called as the remote magisterium, the magisterium that's the teachings that's always been held, the ordinary and universal magisterium. So when this is the case, you can appeal to it, but there has to be serious reasons why you're doing so. But this also goes back to the issue we mentioned in the beginning regarding whether the Pope can teach heresy non-definitively. So Dr. Robert Fasigi, Dave Armstrong, Ron Conti deny that he can teach heresy in his official capacity, even in a non-definitive way. And so they'll cite Vatican I, distinguishing between so-called the papal infallibility and the never-failing faith of Peter. So in this context, the First Vatican Council is referring exclusively to papal infallibility. And
you left off with Vatican I, and you said it was limited to just infallible teaching, not...
Yeah. So when it says never failing faith of Peter, it's referring to the papal infallibility. And so they'll cite Bishop Vincent Gasser's Relatio, to the effect that he's saying that they're dogmatizing Bellarmine's view that a pope can't be a heretic, or his fourth view. So what Bellarmine's fourth view actually says is, regardless of whether a pope can be a heretic as a private teacher, he cannot teach it. He cannot hold the church to this teaching. So if you actually continue into Bellarmine's writings regarding the fourth view, he explicitly is referring to papal infallibility. He's not referring to some non-definitive infallibility or protection. He's exclusively referring to papal infallibility. And this is the same for the Relatio. So if you actually read, I think it's paragraph 40 of the Relatio, Bishop Gasser is actually referring to papal infallibility. He mentions papal infallibility exclusively. So it is exclusively referring to papal infallibility. The Church or Vatican I did not define some distinct doctrine regarding the never-failing faith of Peter. It's the same doctrine. It's papal infallibility.
What about Vatican II? Does that elaborate into it at any depth?
Well, I think Dr. John Joy addresses this particular line of argument in his book. I forget. I don't think there's anything that I can come up with that would hold that Pope can't teach heresy in in his non-definitive teaching. And even what's his I forget what his name is, Journay. Yes, that's his name. In the Word Incarnate, his treatise, he even explicitly says that the church has not defined whether a pope can be a heretic or not. So
Colin Gordon asks, can you speak to the claim that the living magisterium seemingly failed to teach moral truths? Is it possible to have a living magisterium that fails to teach the truth?
So you'd have to cite an example of when the magisterium has failed to teach moral truths. So, for example, there's even a case, as I was arguing with someone on a debate chat, he cites an example of when a pope actually permitted the case of divorce and remarriage, and I think it was the 9th century. I'd have to, I forget which pope it was. I can probably cite it in the chat, not the chat, but the comment section afterwards. So the pope, in certain instances, can fail. If a pope can teach heresy, he can teach it both in terms of theology and morality. So unless he's referring to like a consistent failure to teach, you would have to cite an example when that's the case.
All right. Fair enough. And by the way, I'm going to be answering, maybe you could speak to this one. Even theologians who admitted that a pope could be a heretic said that such a pope's official teachings would always be sufficiently safe for belief.
Yeah, I actually addressed this in my book. So this goes back to the teaching of Vatican I. Vatican I did not define that the church is protected absolutely from error. Okay, so to be so-called infallibly safe is a contradiction of terms. It's either infallible or it's not. There's no infallible safety of the magisterium. It's either infallible or it's not. You can, if it's not infallible, they're good.
Yeah, you can't have a teaching that's infallible but not really safe, or anything like that. A non-infallible teaching can be safe or not safe, but an infallible teaching, by definition, has to be safe.
Yeah, so there's no such thing as a non-infallible, infallible safe teaching. This doesn't make sense. It's either infallibly safe or it's not absolutely safe. It's safe in a certain general respect, but ultimately it's not safe.
Right. So it would be a situation where, so like with any belief that I have, there's a certain probability that I'm in error. Sometimes it's very low, sometimes it's very high, but if it's non-infallible by nature, there's some degree to which I could be wrong. However, when it comes to something which is taught infallibly, like the Assumption of Mary or her Immaculate Conception, I'm safe in holding to that viewpoint, and there is no percentage of error. Now, according to Colin Gordon has another question. Can you tackle John Lane's argument that the Pope himself cannot become a source of doctrinal confusion? He claims this is incompatible with the Church's understanding of the papacy.
Well, if a pope can be a heretic, I don't understand how he cannot be a source of doctrinal confusion.
Also, there's a distinction between the Pope himself being a source of doctrinal confusion and the circumstances around him, which create doctrinal confusion. So, for example, you have a 24-hour media, multiple contradicting stories. You might have various layers of which you have to peel back. Not to mention, you have to judge the person's intentions as well as an individual. So he himself might not be a source of confusion, but the circumstances surrounding him might. In most recent history, let's say, although it doesn't touch his office, Pope Francis, when he came out in favor of civil unions, that was a huge source of confusion and scandal for Catholics. But I don't think anyone was going to pretend that, this would unseat him or anything.
No, my argument is if the Pope himself can be a heretic, he can teach heresy publicly, I see no reason why he wouldn't be able to be a source of doctrinal confusion. So, yeah,
Pope Honorius was a source of doctrinal confusion, and he was still considered Pope.
But going back to the non-definitive teachings, we can even cite examples of theological error regarding, we actually discussed this online regarding the Council of Florence's teaching to the Arminians. So depending on like how one interprets this, although non-definitive, it said that the matter was the handing over of the instruments. So regarding how one interprets this particular claim, whether it's simply it wasn't defining specifically the matter of the sacraments, but simply the rite of the sacraments, as Pius XII taught, there's legitimate disagreement. And then there's the example of I think it was Nicholas I regarding the baptismal formula, which Bellarmine himself considered erroneous. So, although not heretical, properly speaking, these are theological errors which have some serious implications. And I also mentioned the previous pope regarding his permission of divorce or marriage. I'll cite him in the link or in the comment section afterwards. I don't have it right now, but so all these examples, these are sources of doctrinal confusion. Unless you want to claim that the Catholic Church is false, I don't see how that's going to work out for you. But even the Eastern Orthodox, if you point out errors, I mean, I can point out all the errors throughout the centuries of the East, so it really doesn't do anything.
That is a good point as well. And you know what? Even with Protestants, there are various atheist objections to Holy Scripture being, in some sense, contradictory. Personally, I hold that any tension in Scripture is only apparent in nature. And if I can do that with sacred Scripture, if I could say, look, I don't know how these two passages are ultimately reconciled, but all I know is that it's infallible, and I have that as my starting position. I don't see why I couldn't have that with my pontiff or an ecumenical council.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, there's actually something else to get into as well. What would it take, for example, to falsify the claim of Vatican I? Because I've stated, for example, that if a pope was to dogmatically define the sacrament of marriage as extending to homosexual persons, then that would be, for me, an indication that, okay, Catholicism has just officially been falsified. Do you think that that would count as falsification, or do you think that there would still be hope, or that I'm just being too rash in that one?
Well, yeah, that actually involved two distinct issues. Besides papal infallibility, there's a general infallibility of the sacraments, the legitimacy of the sacraments. So it'll be a twofold error, two distinct errors. So yeah, it would definitely undermine papal infallibility and the church's indefectibility as a whole.
All right. So yeah, it can be falsified. Thank you, James. Sorry, my friend James and I have Father James have a bit of a back and forth about whether or not Catholicism can truly be falsified. I think he'd say something along the lines of, well, you could just say that he's been automatically deposed at that point. Could we say that the Pope has been automatically deposed, or not really?
It would have no, unless you to claim he was never validly elected in the first place by appealing to whatever, it was still violated.
Right.
So it doesn't say he was automatically deposed.
I see. So unless he was, if let's assume that, I don't know, a future pope did say it, and all the bishops of the world, or at least a good chunk of them, said, yeah, we declare you to be no longer a member of the Christian Church, and you are thereby deposed of all jurisdiction. Like, at that point, we would say, okay, Catholicism has been salvaged. It might have taken a big hit, but it's been salvaged.
No, I would deny that. If he's exercising papal infallibility, actually, so as I mentioned, there's two issues involved with this one. Not only would it violate papal infallibility if he's defining it ex cathedra, but it would violate the general infallibility of the church regarding the sacraments, so secondary objects of infallibility. So it violates two things.
All right, so
actually, I want to discuss regarding so when a pope is an actual heretic, okay, so suppose he's a public heretic, so what happens to him, okay? Is he ipso facto deposed, or does the church have an issue in issuing declaratory sentence? So according to Bellarmine, he explicitly says in two places that the Pope remains a superior unless he has been legitimately the Pope. And this is the context of public heresy, not occult heresy. And I discuss this in the book. And so, yeah, that's what I got.
All right. Okay. Greg wants to make a clarification. Or he wants to clarify my mistake. I didn't say infallibly safe. I said sufficiently safe, but they mean the same thing. There is the possibility of error, but adhering to this error would not lead one astray from the faith or from salvation.
Yeah, let me comment on that. There's actually some theologians and some Sedevacantists. I debated a guy by the name of Daniel Jackson who claims that it's infallibly safe. So that's what I was assuming. But if it's safe in a general sense, I have no problem with that.
All right. Now, here's a question for you regarding maybe a more concrete issue. If you haven't really explored it to a point where you feel confident enough to give an answer, feel free to just pass off on it. But I do want to ask concerning Pope Francis's decision concerning the teaching around the death penalty. Do you think it would go contrary to Catholic teaching? And if so, where does that leave us? And if not, why not?
Well, several theologians have already assessed this. Dr. Christian Washburn will be one of them. I think even Father Brian Harrison also addressed it. There's several theologians that go through the arguments regarding this being merely a prudential decision, given the circumstances that there's no sufficient reason to implement it. One could disagree legitimately with his prudential decision. Of course, you can take the alternative route and say, well, this is an actual doctrinal claim that's intrinsically evil or whatnot. There's arguments to be made, but given this particular doubt, you can't claim he's a notorious heretic, such that would involve his deposition.
So it's just not a clear enough teaching that the church cannot develop its past teaching that the death penalty is the church. So it's possible to. There's actual theological opinion that says that it's possible to teach that the death penalty is actually intrinsically evil, despite past church teaching.
No.
Oh, okay. I'm misunderstanding you then.
No. So what I'm saying is they claim. So one can argue legitimately that this is heretical based on the ordinary and universal magisterium. Okay. But one can also argue that's merely a prudential decision, although erroneous, but it's merely prudential, not a doctrinal one. And so, given the doubt, you cannot claim he's a notorious heretic. Now, I actually want to discuss regarding divine law and manifest or notorious heresy. Okay. So, divine law itself, we cannot find in divine law which says how public a crime must be for it to be notorious, or in this case, heresy. Nor does it define how certain one must be regarding his imputability. So these are prudential decisions that must be determined by an ecclesial judge. So I'll ask any Sedevacantist, find for me in divine law, which says how public a crime must be, and find for me how certain the people must be regarding his imputability. So I've searched and I've found nowhere where it says this. So,
all right, very good. Now let's see. By the way, feel free to ask any more questions. I'll leave this up for 10 minutes. If I don't see any questions up, I'll be happy to close it down. But in the meantime, I think we could still discuss a few more things. Now, we discussed the death penalty and whether or not that could be considered prudential, or whether or not we could consider it to be contrary to the we could consider it heretical, but only in such a way that it doesn't really make Pope Francis a manifest heretic. So I gather that. Now, another issue that's kind of stirred up the pontificate a little is Amoris Laetitia. And feel free to address this however you want. If you want to pass over, again, that's fine. It might take up a lot of time nuancing it. And if so, then I'll be happy to let you pass.
Well,
but
I'll actually address it. So there's actually a great blog called Reduced Culpability. Okay, I think it's on WordPress. Actually, yeah, Reduced Culpability. I probably can find it. And so it goes through like all the arguments posed against AL, and so they'll assess it within terms of like giving communion to objectively sinful, people in objectively sinful situations, but given their subjective culpability, whether it be legitimate in certain cases to give them communion. And so I don't think an accusation of heresy would apply, although you might consider it something that's, evil, but I don't know if heresy would be the appropriate accusation.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, and actually that's another thing to discuss too. Even in the theological manuals, there's always a distinction between heresy, error, approximate heresy, and approximate error. I think if memory serves, heresy would be giving a proposition that goes directly against a teaching of the faith, something either dogmatic or de fide. Error would be going against a teaching of the faith, in addition to giving a proposition that goes not directly against the faith, but against the faith plus one reasonably certain proposition. So, for example, assuming what Pope Francis said about same-sex civil unions is accurate and we've understood it properly, even in that situation, it wouldn't be directly contrary to a dogma or something de fide, but rather what we know is that marriage is between one man and one woman. That is a de fide and dogmatic teaching, dogmatic. And teaching directly contrary to that would be saying that, this can apply to men and women too. Now, of course, Pope Francis didn't say that. He said something about civil unions. All right, so if it follows that's the case for marriage, then it should follow that even if there was a civil union, a kind of cohabitation, that principle should extend to civil unions as well. And that's based off of the fact that the moral law is directed towards the common good. So that's just something which we hold to be naturally certain. In that light, Pope Francis would be in error, but he would not be heretical. At least that would be my judgment on that. If you'd like to contradict me, I'm not married to this position. Would that be the case, or do you think that I'm not really spelling it out properly, or just not applying the difference properly?
There was a great article on public discourse. I forget whether it was Patrick Lee or Ryan Anderson. I forget who the authors were, and they address his comments. So I'll try to briefly address his comments. So the state cannot propose any alternative unions that would either diminish marriage, and so this case of civil unions would clearly put an alternative vision of marriage. And so the state cannot do so. So his comments are definitely a moral error, whether they be heretical or not. So I'll leave that for theologians to determine, but definitely cannot, the state cannot do so. And so actually, Ron Conti, I want to mention him, he runs a blog, a WordPress. So he argues that given so-called freedom of religion or freedom of conscience, that the state can implement these civil unions because, people are obviously allowed to express their own beliefs. We cannot hinder them to do so. Of course, this is absolute erroneous view of religious liberty and freedom of conscience, but just to assess this argument. So the states cannot implement moral evils. And so it was Paul VI in his, I think it was like, it's not an encyclical, but it's like the judgment of the CDF regarding abortion. It explicitly says that the state has no right whatsoever to permit abortion. Okay? And so the same principle, this moral evil of same-sex marriage, same-sex civil unions, these are obvious moral evils which do not serve the common good. Of course, people will cite the example of Aquinas regarding prostitution, but here there's an important qualification. So the state might only permit certain evils to avoid greater evils. In the case of civil unions, I have no idea what greater evils would be avoided. So I don't think that line of argument would apply.
Let's see. I believe maybe someone can make the claim that you're avoiding the greater evil of allowing homosexuals to incur economic instability, threats on. It would leave them more open to discrimination, etc. I can't really think of anything in terms of anything apart from a kind of secular humanistic justification, but I think at most that's all you can say, and I don't think that overcomes it.
Yeah, I don't think it does either, because first we have to assess, okay, population of homosexuality and how this affects the general public regarding defiguring the image of marriage, what marriage really is between a man and woman for the purpose of raising a family. And so I think this outweighs in itself any sort of benefits that civil unions might have. And of course, no secular society is interested in so-called civil unions. They want the real thing. This is not what people are arguing for. But even given this assumption that they want civil unions, still you're not avoiding greater evil. So
Yeah.
just to use the example of economic instability. So I don't know what sort of instability you would be having. You can't have kids. So I don't know how you benefit from that. Civil union.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to get into that too much, but another thing you touched on is some people have emphasized this as like a compromise position. Even they justify Pope Francis's statement on it by saying, look, he was only saying it because he doesn't want to incur the greater evil of a gay marriage. He's only taking this as a lesser evil, as a kind of compromise to avoid the greater one. Now, maybe most charitably we could say he's factually wrong, because in all our experiences we know once you accept a civil same-sex union, same-sex marriage happens anyway. But at the very least we could say that he's not aware of it because of personal ignorance rather than and naivete rather than him holding to something pernicious.
So that'd be actually legitimate, but I don't know if that's actually what he's saying. He says I supported that. So I don't know if he's supporting that particular, like, voting for civil unions in the case when, like, there's two opposing views, same-sex marriage versus civil unions. That might be all right, but here he says he supported civil unions in themselves. At least that's how I interpreted it. Mm-hmm. I might be wrong. It might be just given that particular circumstance, I supported that then. But people have obviously taken that I support civil unions in a general sense.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, and that's fair enough. I think there's a priest Matthew Schneider. He's a member of the Legionnaires of Christ. He actually wrote various blog posts trying to soften Pope Francis's position. Now, I don't think you really need to soften it, even if it's like at face value. I don't think it follows that he's a public and manifest heretic necessarily, or it doesn't interfere with the claims of the First Vatican Council. But my only point is there have been various points where one can maybe see how he might come to that position, even if it is erroneous. Like, at least he's not saying it's a good unto itself.
Sorry about that.
No worries. And to be fair, this is a lot of speculation. Like, the source comes from a documentary that was created by a less than reputable documenter who does have a personal bias. There was some editing that was highly suspect. So it's really hard to even just come to like a certain conclusion with the information we were presented.
Yeah, there's limited information because we don't have the whole video, mm-hmm. So you can't really determine one way or the other what his comments actually meant.
Right. In fact, one could argue that it's easier with Pope Honorius because, at the very least, we have the letters.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So I don't think there are any more questions. Do you feel comfortable just closing the broadcast, or do you want to touch on something that I didn't really touch on yet?
Well, I would invite any Sedevacantist who watches this in the future, contact us. I'll be happy to discuss Sedevacantist Sedevacantism with you. I'm friendly towards Sedevacantists, have no issues with you except your doctrines, but anyone that's willing to come on, debate, discuss, I'll be happy to do anytime.
Nice. And yeah, I'll be happy to host. Feel free to contact either of us. Contra, do you have your email address or any personal contact available on your blog, or is comment?
You can comment on any of my blog posts.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and if any of you want to just comment on this very video, usually my YouTube gives me a notification and an update, and sometimes I like to check on old videos periodically anyway, so that's going to be here too. Now, to close off, would you be interested in leading us in a prayer? Hail Mary, our Father, your call.
Okay, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Lord Jesus Christ, we ask you to bless this session, that it may be fruitful for your kingdom. We ask you to bring any Sedevacantists watching this video to discern further the truth, that they may come into a relationship with you, in a relationship with your holy church, the Catholic Church. And we pray this in your holy name. Amen. In your Father, Son, and Spirit.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. And for all those who are listening through a recording, thank you for sitting through the whole 1 hour and 22 minutes. God bless you all, and please have a great day.